Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Matt Gifford, and he's joining me from Cyprus, which is hot and sunny, as opposed to England, where I am right now, which is kind of a little dreary, actually. I think that was a good move you made there, Matt. And we're going to be talking about OAuth 2 and how you can use that to do really amazing logins on your ColdFusion apps. And we'll look at how it works, what it is, how you can use it in ColdFusion, and we'll ask him what his favorite wrapper is, and I mean code wrapper, not music wrapper there. And we'll also look at some of the intricacies of registering your app with Facebook and Twitter and Google and some of the other providers you can use OAuth 2 with. And so if you haven't met Matt before, he is a cool guy. He used to run the user group for ColdFusion in England. And he's also presented at a lot of different conferences. And his company, MonkeyTweets, does mobile apps and ColdFusion development. And he's also written a book. What's your book, Matt?
I've written a few books.
A few.
The first one was object-oriented programming in ColdFusion. I've written PhoneGap application development and the very quickly updated PhoneGap 4 application development. And a lot of magazine tutorials and articles for UK industry magazines as well.
Well, great. Well, it's wonderful to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So for folks who haven't really come across OAuth 2, what the heck is it?
It is a possibly confusing beast that actually was developed to make life easier for developers. So let's go with the prime example of a login. If you're building a web application where you want your users to log in or create an account, if you're building something from scratch, you have to worry about storing information, building the whole processes to take the form submission, validate it, send it back if it's false, log them in, hash them, deal with all the password stuff. OAuth kind of simplifies that a lot. And you can delegate that whole back-end validation and the user access to a different provider, Facebook being the prime example. So you could just have a button on your site that says, I want to log in using my Facebook account, and they will redirect you to Facebook. You log in using them, or if you're already in, it will just pop up and say, do you want this site to use your details? And away you go. And you receive a minimal payload compared to all of the other stuff that you might have had to have done behind the scenes if you were rolling your own.
So that makes it easier for you as a developer, but it also makes it easier for your users because they don't have to remember yet another password and user ID.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's not quite a worldwide single sign-on solution, but yeah, for people that are either on Facebook all the time, Twitter, they have Google Mail open all the time. They have, chances are most people will have at least one of those three. And those are three of the biggest providers around for OAuth 2. So you can just log in using one of those services, which means it's one password less that you have to remember, less spam than you have to remember. So you don't have to deal with someone else sending you reminders or email validation. You're already part of that system. So the app that you want to log in is basically just delegating to them and getting back a minor bit of information about you that you actually control. You're able to either approve it or deny it. So you know what information that the application you're logging into is requesting about you, which is another massive benefit.
And I guess the fancy term for this is social login.
Yes, yeah. Everyone's a social guru now. We're on at least a few of those sites. So yeah, using the social logins because they can then, the application, if it has you logged in, say it is Facebook or Twitter, they can then use, if you've given them permission to, they can then access your timeline or post on your behalf. So in some ways it can benefit the site that you're logging into. But again, it's only if you've actually granted that access. So it's embracing the social atmosphere and the cloud services that are out there already, and making life simpler for the consumer and the web application as well.
So what kind? You mentioned Facebook and Twitter. What other people? What other providers can you log in through?
The big hitters. We have Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. For all the business geeks out there. Microsoft Services, or Microsoft Live, I think it's called, GitHub, Bitbucket, Instagram. I believe Yahoo have a variation. That's essentially most of the big sites and services that you use will have an OAuth variation. Most of them are up to OAuth 2 now. A few sites are still lagging behind on OAuth 1, but yeah, the majority of the big hitters you can log in using their services.
Cool. Now you mentioned OAuth 1. Is that totally compatible with OAuth 2, or are they totally separate things? Or
they're separate entities. The OAuth 2 protocol document is a very, very interesting read. I've been skimming it for years, still haven't finished it, and it's kind of like the HTML5 spec. It's constantly changing and there are new additions being added, so you kind of give up after a while. But you get to learn where the key points are. But they are similar to an extent, but also drastically different insofar as the ease of use and the elegance of OAuth 2. I gave a talk on OAuth 1 about 6 years ago, I think, at Scotch on the Rocks, when I just started diving into it, because I'd written the MonkehTweets ColdFusion wrapper for Twitter, and that's what really got me interested in the whole OAuth environment and the protocol. I'd basically written this wrapper when they were using basic authentication, and it was a breeze. So you could just set up a very, very simple Twitter thing in your ColdFusion application, send your username and password through in the HTTP request, which we know is not safe. But from a developer's point of view, it made it just crazily easy to do. And then it broke because they introduced OAuth 1. So I had to very quickly learn how to implement that and what it was. And that took a weekend to get that actually up and running and working again. And at that time, they were already planning OAuth 2. It was something that was in the distance. They had a kind of project line for it. So OAuth 1 wanted to make life easier and more secure. The emphasis really was on security. So taking away the username and password fields being sent in the headers or being sent in your form fields. You had to kind of do a signature dance, really, where you spoke to an app, or the web application you were logging into spoke to, let's use Twitter as the example, spoke to Twitter as the service provider and said, hey, I've got Matt here, he wants to log in. These are his credentials. Can you send me something back so that I can then ask him if he wants to proceed? And then this kind of multi-step dance happened where there was a lot of back and forth, which was secure, but very, very confusing. I'm actually confusing myself now talking about it, because it was one of these, it honestly had a lot of steps. But it got the end result. The user was able to log in and use the services. OAuth 2 massively strips that back, where you have minimal steps needed to actually get the end result. So you literally send a submission off to Twitter, they send you a code item back, or to the application. The application then sends that code back, gets another token, and you're pretty much in. So from 5 or 6 steps down to 2, maybe 3. It is a lot more secure. The user has the ability to revoke access at any time, as they did with OAuth 1, but it seems to be a lot clearer with OAuth 2. And you have the added benefit of what we call scopes now in OAuth 2. So I don't know if you, Michael, have logged into Facebook or a LinkedIn application using OAuth 2, but these applications will kind of pop up and say, you know, Matt's awesome app wants to log you in and wants to use your email address, your profile, does not want to be able to post to your timeline.
Right.
So you can very quickly see the intention of the application, whether they just want your email address or whether they want to actually farm all of your friend lists and be able to post spam on your timeline without you knowing. So you can very quickly decline that and revoke the application if it becomes too much as well. So It's a lot easier for the developer to access with OAuth 2. The end user seems to have a lot more control over it. And yeah, the amount of steps involved are drastically reduced.
Yeah, I know these single sign-on protocols can get pretty complicated. So, but do you have to deal with that complication if you're using a wrapper for it, or?
No, on the whole, no. I've written a few of them now. I've just been adding to a new one that I've updated for OAuth to make it much easier. So I have a base component and then some very small plugins. So if you want to use Facebook, you literally just provide, I think, the token keys that you need. So as an end user using those wrappers, you literally just give the bare minimum arguments that is required, and it will handle all of the heavy lifting for you. So ideally, I want other developers to be able to use the OAuth 2 protocol without having to actually worry how it works underneath. Just take this, it will work for you.
Great. And underneath how is it communicating? Is it sending XML, or what is it doing?
I don't believe any of them use XML anymore. Luckily, the XML payloads are a thing of the past. You have to have, it's very heavily header based. So you're making HTTP post requests to submit some header information, which is really the signature that you want to send it. And the signature is a concatenation of like the particular secret value and a token value. There are a number of different elements here. So from the user logging in, you're still providing some account details, but not to the application you want to log into. You're providing them to Facebook, for example. But the website that you're using has to register themselves with Facebook or Twitter or Google and say, this is my application, here's my URL, I want to use it for these purposes, and I just want to retrieve email address, bit of profile information. And they get generated an API key and a token value. And it's those bits of information that are sent in the header. So the user doesn't really have to do much. The web application will transmit those. Facebook will determine whether they are valid web applications set up to receive it, and then submit the information back, normally in a URL parameter that the calling application then knows how to deal with and finish that communication.
So we'll talk a bit about how you register your app in a little bit. But if someone was thinking of doing this, what other alternatives are there to using OAuth 2? Are there any? I mean,
there are. I haven't fully investigated all of them, purely because the avenues that I've taken have led me fully down the OAuth 2 path, and as I say, the big hitters use them, so I've kind of stuck with those. OAuth 1 is still out there. It is still a viable option. Maybe not as secure, not as easy, but it's still there. OpenID is another alternative. The OpenID Foundation kind of aimed to provide a one entry point system as well. That seemed to be quite large a while ago. I haven't used it. I certainly haven't investigated it for quite some time. So I don't really want to say either way whether or not it's valid. Mozilla had a single sign-on solution as well, but again, I haven't really dived too far into that one. But there are a lot of alternatives out there. If you Google OAuth 2 alternatives, I'm sure you'll find, or the listeners or viewers will find some possibilities out there for them.
Well, and the obvious thing that I'm sure most listeners are doing, they don't do any of this. They just force their users to create yet another user ID and password.
Yeah. Yeah, if you can farm that off to someone else and you just receive a payload and store that small bit of information, then your life is much easier. And also, you don't really, it helps to minimize any possible PCI compliance issues as well, because you're not storing passwords. You might store a like an ID number that relates to a Facebook login, or a Twitter number that relates to that particular login, but you're not storing necessarily, unless you choose to, full-on emails, passwords. You don't have to worry about encryptions or hashing or any of that kind of stuff. That's one of the massive benefits about farming it off to somewhere else as well.
The other one that I've come across is SAML. I don't know if you've looked at that at all.
I haven't, no.
Yeah, it seemed to involve a lot of sending XML back and forth, and you have to mess around with the key, and it was real picky about having things in a certain order in the packet, and without telling you in the documentation that's the order you needed to have. So I'm kind of curious whether OpenAuth is easier to use.
I certainly remember fighting that fight with XML payloads in the past, so I'm glad that I've turned my back on that. I think the benefit of just having like a code value sent in the URL for you and then sending that back is so much easier than having to deal with XML structures and just building the structure to send before you even have to worry about the validation. It's just XML. Yeah, no.
Just say no.
Right? It has its place, but no.
Yeah. So if someone wanted to use this today from ColdFusion, what do they need to do? They download a wrapper?
Yeah, it depends what service you want to use. So the first thing you would want to do is actually register your application. So again, let's use Facebook as an example. They have their own developer console, just like Google do. They have their apps console. Twitter have apps.twitter.com. Facebook have their developer portal. And essentially you would log in using your own Facebook account, and you essentially have to register an application. So by that point, you really need to have your local web URL, your local development URL, because you're hopefully going to test it locally before you push it out to production. So you essentially create a new application with them, and you provide it a name, maybe a description. They already have a bit of information about you because you've signed in using their services, and you provide a callback URL, which is a very, very important property. So the callback URL really is when you make a submission to Facebook and you're requesting some information, that is the URL that they know using based upon your client ID and your secret value that you send in the header. They use that callback URL that you also send to validate you as well. So if that doesn't match, then it won't return you. And that is the URL that they will send the user back to with the bits of information that you need. So you have to provide a URL for them. Some other minor bits of information. Sometimes you have to provide the scope, which is basically a checkbox of items that you want to receive, like the email address, the ability to mine all of the user's information, or just view their name. And once that is done, they will generate the client ID for you, which is basically the API key, and a token secret value. And you take both of those, save them somewhere locally, safe, not in the cloud, please. And then you would go and find a Facebook wrapper. There are some out there already. I wrote one, which I will send the link to at the end. There are also, if you check out forgebox.io as well, there is a great wrapper on there. A number of wrappers actually developed by the one developer. I can't remember his name right now. And he wrote ColdBox modules for Twitter, for Facebook, for LinkedIn, for Google, that all use the base underlying schema. So they're very nice, simple plugins. So once you've found your Facebook wrapper, you would download it, install it, and ideally, all you should then have to do is, when you instantiate that component, is provide that API key and that token secret. You might have to provide a couple of extras, but that is the bare minimum requirements. And then it should work. You might have to do a few method calls to allow the user to interact with it, but that is the maximum that you should really have to do, because all of the rest of the OAuth 2 stuff has been built for you. So once you register the app and you have the API key and the secret, you're good to go. And you can essentially replicate that for Twitter, for LinkedIn, for Google. They all have their differences. Some have very strict requirements. I think Google has quite strict requirements on what you send in, what you request. They even recommend that you request certain bits of information just for added security. Other providers are a bit looser on what you can send through, but they all follow very much the same protocol. So you will start to see, when you look at each of them, the core bits of information that you have to send through, and ultimately what each one of them is going to send back to you. And they're very, very similar. So replication after that point doesn't really become a problem.
And do these things, they give you the key, do they last forever, or they last for a certain number of years? Or
the API key and the token secret last indefinitely. As the application owner, you can go in, and if you fear that someone has obtained them, you can quickly revoke it or regenerate it. So you do have a lot of control over that. As a user, if you, so say I've logged into an application that is using my Twitter credentials, most of these big providers will actually display a menu option for you, probably in the settings panel somewhere, that says these are the applications using your login, or that you've granted access to. You can then peruse those. There might be ones that you clearly remember and you still use, others that may have duped you into signing it, or ones that you just know aren't around anymore. So you can clearly identify those normally when you signed in, and you can revoke access to them. So as soon as you've done that, basically Twitter will kind of handle and wipe out whatever key you've given to that end user, to that other application. So even if they try to make any requests on your behalf, it just won't work, because those keys are gone. So there's a lot of control on either side now.
Great. I looked on ForgeBox. Was it Jeremy DeYoung who wrote that?
Thank you very much. I was actually using that this morning, and the name just didn't stick in. I'm sorry, Jeremy.
No worries. So we'll put the link to that social Twitter login thing in ForgeBox on the show notes.
Of course, MonkehTweets. If you're using Twitter, then obviously MonkehTweets is the one to go as well.
What a coincidence that that's got the same beginning as your company name.
I know, right?
And that's spelled not with a Y, but with an H. So
it is. Monkey with an H, just to add confusion.
Yes. Why does it have an H?
I can never remember.
Oh, okay.
It just ended up with an H, and we stuck with it. But that is the one wrapper.
Well, the H is underneath the Y on a QWERTY keyboard, so maybe you just typed it that way, you know.
It was a late night. The finger slipped. The company branding came from there.
So MonkehTweets is the wrapper you wrote for Twitter that uses OAuth 2.
Yeah, that was the first one that used the basic authentication, and then very quickly had to ramp up to OAuth 1 and then to OAuth 2. So a lot of time and a lot of coffee went into that one weekend when they flipped it. So I'm very, very proud of that. And it seems to be used by a lot of people. A lot of ColdFusion apps are using it actively, which is great. So it's obviously open source and free, and pull requests are welcome. But other Twitter wrappers are also available.
Great. So just so we're clear, what exactly does OAuth 2 cost? Do you have to pay for any of these registrations or the code, or?
No, absolutely free. It is all free. There is a small amount of time setting it up. So, going into apps.twitter.com or the Facebook console or the Google console, you have to declare and register your application. It can get a little bit tedious. Google's console isn't the easiest to navigate at the best of times, even if you're following a tutorial that clearly points out which links to press, because they seem to update their UI as well. So if you have a local development environment, you have to set one up for that, because the callback URL has to match the URL that you are using locally. If you then have a staging environment, and obviously a production environment, you would have to set up one for each of those as well. If you then have an application that allows OAuth 2 through Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, it can grow exponentially. So there is a bit of time in setting those up, but once they're done, you have a lot of security on there, and you know that they're sorted. And if you're using something like ColdBox, where you can clearly define, if I'm in a development environment, then use these in your config, then it becomes fairly easy to manage from a code point of view. The providers, the service providers, don't charge you, at least the big ones don't. If you cross any that do try and charge you, don't use them. I think the benefit for them is that they have people using their services. It means that they're going to stay as a relevant service because they clearly have the data.
Mm-hmm.
So there shouldn't be any monetary involvement, and it's all free.
That's great. Yeah, I imagine it does kind of lock users in, because even if they wanted to delete their Twitter account, they still need to keep it just to be able to log into the things that they used it to associate with.
Yeah, I mean, there are ways to, an application I'm working on at the moment has social logins through the three big hitters, but also the ability to create your own custom login through the service as well. So say I've logged in using Twitter, I can then add the Facebook or the Google Mail. So if I accidentally click on one of the wrong social logins, I've already pre-approved them to that particular account. Or likewise, if I create a custom account and then I choose I want to add one of my socials, you can do that as well. So you can still tie them together. Obviously, if you just want to keep it social and just use the social logins, then they're all done for you.
So anything else about OAuth 2 that our listeners should know?
It is a lot of fun. It is confusing. I aim in my prime goal at the CF Camp session is to guide you through it. Again, in a lot more detail, actually showing some code samples, showing clearly in slide form the steps involved, originally in OAuth 1 and now in OAuth 2, so you can see how much easier it is. And essentially, I want the people to leave the CF Camp session with a much clearer understanding of what OAuth 2 is, to not be frightened of it, and if they wanted to actually be able to create not only web apps that consume services like Facebook or Twitter, but maybe actually roll their own service so that they can become the service provider if their application's big enough, and they can actually be sending out the user data to others instead.
Sounds exciting. So we'll talk a little bit more about CF Camp in a moment, but tell me about ColdFusion in Cyprus, because that's where you relocated to from the UK a few years back.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the first things I did when we were looking to move was quickly Google the state of the development environment over here. Luckily, there are a lot of development houses, and those, I think there are two fairly close to me within 10 minutes each way that are very heavy ColdFusion houses. I think one of them certainly uses ColdBox and the ColdBox suite. There does seem to be a thriving ColdFusion community. They're quiet. The web over here, as I've found, doesn't seem to have taken as much hold recently. So a lot of the current trends don't seem to have made it over here yet. But there are very heavy web houses over here that are using it. One of the big companies over here is quite a large name in prototyping applications, so I was quite happy. I didn't realize they were in Cyprus until I moved here, and they have ColdFusion behind the scenes as well, I believe. There doesn't yet appear to be a ColdFusion user group though, so if there's time and coffee available, then I might look into actually getting something set up.
Well, that sounds exciting for all of CF developers in Cyprus. I encourage them to contact you and offer coffee.
Yeah, please. That would be most welcome.
So let's turn to why you're proud to use ColdFusion, Matt.
It's just an awesome language. It was the language that if we forget my minor stint with PHP when I very first started development, which I think everyone did to an extent, ColdFusion it's an amazing language. It's the first one that really took hold of me. I was able to understand. I think something as stupidly simple as a CF dump tag when I first started was a mind-blowing experience, because you could instantly see visually using color what the information was. I think it's a brilliant language. I know that rapid application development term gets bandied around a lot, but it's still very, very prevalent. I use other languages. I dive over to Node. I dive over to JavaScript. I've played with Ruby. I've played with Python. And they're all great for particular reasons. If you find a language that suits a task, use it. But I inevitably find myself coming back to ColdFusion because it does the job. And the language enhancements recently have been fantastic. If you look at the Lucy engine as well, I think it's opened up the gateway to a lot of ColdFusion developers or CFML developers. It's a very, very easy language to pick up. The community is one of the best still around. I think the ColdFusion community is amazing, always has been. I've made a lot of very, very good friends through that community, and it's kept me employed for quite some time. So ColdFusion is a fantastic language, plenty of people out there to help you. We want to see it continue to succeed because it is succeeding. It's just a brilliant language, so pick it up and use it if you haven't already.
Great. So, I mean, that does come to, you know, sometimes you read stuff about that ColdFusion is dying, and I think the opposite is true. It's become more alive. But the question I have for you is, what would it take to make ColdFusion even more alive this year?
That is a very, very good question. I used to have the wish lists of, you know, I would love it to have a REPL, a command line REPL tool. I would love it to have a package management tool. Admittedly, it might not have 100% official answers to those, but we have them now. You know, we have the command box tool, which is just amazing. We have ForgeBox, which is our package manager to an extent, as long as people are contributing to the forges and the packages. So my wish list items have been answered. I would just like to continue to see the language evolve. I would like to see it enhance and stay current, really. I know that the engineering teams, they have a particular project cycle, and a lot can change in that particular cycle. So ideas that they had that they might release, unfortunately by that time may then kind of be invalid in web terms in usage. But I know that they've also very quickly kind of flipped things around and introduced some amazing stuff, like the API management tools that went in the last few releases have been very, very welcome. They were long overdue, I think, but the power that they have underneath to control your APIs and kind of manage them and dig into the logs and really filter down the security. So we have a lot now. For it to continue, I would just like to see open source contributions, I suppose. If we can keep the package management libraries populated with valid ColdFusion packages, keep the communications going, keep the chats going, keep the blog posts going, keep podcasts and vidcasts going. As long as we keep the buzz going, then I think it will continue to strive.
Great. So what are you looking forward to at CF Camp in a few weeks?
Beer. Lots and lots of German beer. That is true, but also the schedule, it's sold out, which is amazing. I had no doubt it would sell out, but as it's the only European CF conference now, it's amazing that people are flocking to it. And the schedule this year is insane. Luckily, I'm only giving one talk, so I can easily pop into the other tracks, but it's getting to that point now where I want to clone myself because there's something good in each track. I'm primarily looking forward to actually catching up with a lot of friends and colleagues who I haven't seen for a while. So conferences are always an amazing place to do that, especially the CF conferences. I said it about Scotch, I've said it about CF Camp before. It's kind of like a family reuniting once a year, to sit down, learn new stuff, catch up, and just kind of be together, which I know sounds a bit corny, but
I think it's important to, if you're working on your own, then it helps to see other people once in a while that share the same interests, and
absolutely,
you can talk about what's going on.
And yeah, so it's going to be catching up with a lot of people, and there's a lot of great content out there. I had the schedule open earlier. I'm very big into automation. I've been the last few years have been spent investigating and helping other companies automate their processes and their workflows, and kind of streamlining how they do things. So I love automation, which is why I'm looking forward to the Bitbucket pipelines chat. I've started doing stuff on that, but I would love to learn more about that as well. The Internet of Things, I'm aware of it. I've played with bits, but I'd still like to know how it can help me in my day-to-day life. I want to kind of push a button on my app and everything does everything. But there are just some really amazing talks out there. Some interesting things that I wouldn't have considered, and a lot of topics that I thought I had a grasp on, but after kind of digging into the description, sessions that I'd like to go into as well, and kind of hone up the skills on that. So it's going to be a fun couple of days, I think.
Great, exciting. So if people want to find you online, Matt, what's the best ways to do that?
Probably the best way is on Twitter, at ColdFuMonkey. So ColdFuMonkeh, always a monkey with an H, or www.monkeyworks.com.
Fabulous. Well, thanks so much for being on the CF Alive podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.